Croeso, hello and welcome to Blueprint Cymru, a podcast bringing ideas, experience and ambition to conversations of building a better future for Wales. My name is Simon Hobson. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jess Blair. Jess has served as Director of the Electoral Reform Society Cymru since March 2017. She's a leading advocate for democratic voting reform in Wales, oversees the Society's mission to deliver fair, more proportional electoral system. Her work spans engagement with politicians, committees, civil society and media, making her a familiar and respected voice in Wales's evolving democratic landscape. With a master's degree in Welsh government and politics from Cardiff University, Jess brings deep policy insight and shaping her role which was shaped by her role at the Institute of Welsh Affairs in the Senedd and the EU level in Brussels. She regularly provides expert evidence on electoral reform and is a vocal champion of strengthening Wales democracy through inclusive and transparent processes. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks for having me.
So perhaps you could start by telling the listener a little bit about yourself, how you ended up in the position you're in now, and what sort of made you interested in reforming the electoral system, really.
Honestly, I think probably I'm a bit boring, to be honest with you. I don't think I necessarily kind of had the kind of upbringing that might lead you into politics. Like, my family aren't very political or anything like that. I grew up in mostly in Pembrokeshire, in West Wales, and went to uni to do a history degree, and worked out that a lot of those lectures took place at 9 a.m. So if I did a joint honours with politics, it wouldn't be so early in the morning. So that's kind of how I ended up doing a bit of politics too. And then in my third year, I really hated the module I chose for history. And the only module with space was the Welsh politics, introduction to Welsh politics module. And that kind of started my interest in like devolution. And then over that summer, I was kind of thinking about what to do next, and thought, I'll do the EU integration masters. So I asked Richard Jones, who was my professor at the time, to be a reference, and he called me up and was like, don't do that one, do my masters instead. So that's how I ended up doing a masters in Welsh politics, and kind of from there, I think the rest is history, really.
So what was it about the particular history module you disliked then? Do you remember?
It was on cinema, so it sounded really good in theory, but in practice, it was a lot of talking about really like intellectual, boring films. I've got a really bad attention span. I can't sit through a film.
Quite that, not and then dissect it. Yeah. Well, should we just dive straight in then? So with your work hat on, what's the objective of the Electoral Reform Society in Wales as far as the reform of the voting system is concerned?
Yeah, so I guess ERS really kind of aims to have a better democracy, and the electoral system is a really big part of that, in our view. So in terms of Wales, we've been kind of really campaigning, I think, for a stronger Senedd and stronger local government for quite some time. So one of the campaigns we really kind of led on was around the size of the Senedd increasing, and that kind of package of reforms to really make the Senedd like fit for a 21st century democracy, frankly, kind of correcting I think the reality that 60 Senedd members is just not sufficient. You know, this Parliament should never have been set up with 60 Senedd members. It doesn't kind of align with what took place in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So that kind of really has been our aim over the past decade or so, really. And with local government, we've done a really big campaign around reforming the electoral system there. So since the Local Government Elections Wales Act, councils have been able to choose whether to stick with first past the post or move to the single transferable vote system, which is what's used in Scottish local authority elections. So we've done a lot of work working with councils over the past few years to kind of get them in a position where they might feel more kind of informed or aware of what the options are. And I think
a lot of the councils, of course, have had votes on that, and most have rejected it. So
all of them rejected it. So we managed to get 3 local authorities to a vote.
right.
One of those, Powys, didn't reach a 50%. Ceredigion got over 50% support for changing the electoral system, but didn't reach the 2/3 majority required. Now in Gwynedd, they were 1 short of that 2/3 majority required, and 1 person was missing from that vote. So it's been a really difficult kind of campaign, but I think we've kind of come a long way with that, and I think it has showed a massive amount of support. You know, Gwynedd have to go into the next election knowing that only a third of its councillors actually support the electoral system is heading in with. So there's kind of something wrong, I think, with that. And I think what we did demonstrate with all of these local authorities, they all had a public consultation prior to their votes. Every single public consultation came back with an overwhelming public support for changing the electoral system.
So the councils that use the first past the post system still in Wales, I mean that's something that's also obviously forced on the Westminster elections for Wales, and then with the new Senedd electoral system is going to be the Hont closed system, which again adds another layer of complication to the way that people vote for their representatives, and given the history of the Senedd having a low turnout, it is all of these different ways of electing a representative. Do you think that's adding to turning people away from politics and engaging with what needs to be engaged with?
I don't think so. I think, you know, Scotland, if you look at Scotland, they obviously use first past the post for Westminster elections, STV for local authority elections, AMS for Scottish parliamentary elections. So there are lots of examples of countries navigating different electoral systems very easily. I think the question about turnout is a really big one, and there's a multitude of reasons, I think, for that, which we can probably come on to. But no, I think the situation we're in heading into the next election, the Senedd elections next May, is that we will have a new electoral system. It's not one that ERS have advocated for, but it is a proportional system. So it will kind of, in many ways, kind of guarantee that who you vote for in terms of a party gets represented in the Senedd.
Will it? Because as I understand the Hont, it tends to favour larger parties.
Yeah, it can certainly do that. So there are kind of 2 different approaches that you can use with a list system to Hont or San Nagu. San Nagu is typically seen as favouring smaller parties over larger parties, and parties within the Senedd advocated for the Hont. However, I think the levels of proportionality should increase from what we've seen under AMS. But, you know, ultimately, what anyone wants in an electoral system, I think, is a kind of combination of accountability and proportionality. So if you look at first past the post, that's got great accountability, terrible proportionality. I don't think anyone's going to advocate for the proportionality of first past the post. What you're going to have with closed lists, I think, is better proportionality, much weaker accountability, because you're losing that kind of individual link with your MS. You know, when voters are voting next May, they will only have the option to vote for a party, not an individual candidate.
And of course, it's the parties who decide who goes to the top of those lists.
Exactly. You know, like power, I think, essentially the power of determining who your elected representatives are next year is largely in the hands of political parties, and that's an issue we've constantly raised with the closed list system. I think what we're heading into, though, with the election next May, is going to be really difficult and really complicated. I think a lot of people will slam the new electoral system for the results, when actually this is an electoral system that will deliver results largely reflecting what people have voted for. So it's really funny for me, because I feel like I'm defending it, but kind of criticising it at the same breath.
Yes, it's one of the things I would like to go back to that you mentioned earlier in the conversation is the increase in the number of members of the Senedd. And you say that ERS was in support of that increase, but of course there are detractors from that and some parties which openly criticise that increase. So what is it about having an increase in elected members to the Senedd that the ERS feels is the right thing to do for Wales?
Well, frankly, I think it's correcting, I think I said this earlier, I think it's correcting the inequality that previously existed. You know, 60 Senedd members is not sufficient. Nearly half of the local authorities in Wales have either the same number or more members as the Senedd. That is crazy. The Scottish Parliament was set up with over double the amount of members. Even Stormont, I think, set up with 108, reduced to 90, still significantly higher than the Senedd. So there's that element of kind of correcting the inequality, but then there's also the reality that it just hasn't really worked in terms of the way that the Senedd operates. We've heard numbers of the number of members saying, I sit on 3-4 committees, and that has reduced as kind of committee timetables have been adapted, and some meet fortnightly. But in Westminster, what you see is MPs sitting on one committee, developing that expertise, like really kind of being able to dig into their brief. That hasn't really been able to happen here, and I think there is an hope and an expectation that there will be some improvement in scrutiny in the next Senedd.
Because there's some that would argue the Senedd was purposefully designed to be dysfunctional and to not be able to reach its full potential. Is there a position that the ERS has on that, or?
I'm not really sure. The Senedd was set up in 1999. I was 8 at the time, so I wasn't involved in that. However, I think the way that the Senedd has evolved over time probably reflects that it was set up in a way that wasn't sufficient. And it also kind of comes back to that very often said phrase, process, not an event. And I feel like the evolution of the Senedd has been a process, and it's had to be, because we've kind of had to fight for every little change, whether that be an increase in the powers devolved to the Senedd, or the kind of ability for the Senedd to run as a proper parliament.
Why do you think it is that the Welsh Parliament has had to fight for so much when, as you already mentioned, the Scottish and the Northern Irish parliaments were given more from the outset?
I think that's a question with a multitude of answers. But I do believe that a lot of it stems from the kind of lack of support for setting up the Senedd. It kind of inched over on a knife edge. And I think there's also a perception maybe that Wales has always been treated differently, has always had a weaker civil society, that kind of less established separation, particularly around a separate legal jurisdiction. So there's kind of a perception there that I think would be hard to argue against, that Wales has kind of been seen as differently to Scotland and Northern Ireland, and probably unfairly so.
So given the next Senedd elections coming up in May of next year, and obviously Wales is in a unique position and has taken a lead in giving 16, 17-year-olds a vote. So how will young people shape that next era of Welsh democracy? How do we go beyond just engaging them as a sort of buzzword, and actually building a system that they want to get involved with and their voices are heard?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Votes to 16 hasn't been a kind of build it and they will come movement in Wales. The first election where the franchise was extended was 2021. We know that only about half of 16 and 17-year-olds were actually registered to vote at that election. Turnout was, I think, relatively mirroring the levels we see around 18 to 24-year-olds. So Votes to 16 is very much an ongoing project in Wales. There is no kind of just legislate for it and it will happen. It's going to have to be something that's built up over a multitude of elections in terms of building up democratic education, young people's awareness, removing barriers. So things like the registration process. Can we make that easier for young people? Can we automatically register them? That kind of thing. So that's kind of the short term, I think, need to kind of build up the success of Votes to 16, really engage young people. On a longer term basis, I think the starting point for really involving younger people is both kind of at a democratic education level and ensuring that our schools are kind of world leading in setting up young people for their kind of democratic lives, but also ensuring that the Senedd is kind of fit to receive that kind of engagement from young people, making sure that the outreach it does is really good. And actually, I have to give a lot of credit to the Senedd's engagement team. They do a hell of a lot of outreach, far more than other parliaments in the UK, and they're really good at it. But they're kind of compensating, I think, for a system that doesn't necessarily know how to engage young people in terms of like committees, that kind of thing. So I think involving young people more in that kind of aspect of the parliament would be a real challenge at the moment.
So I thought that automatic registration was coming in for this next election, or have I misunderstood that?
Well, didn't we all? So the recent Elected Bodies Act allowed provisions for 2026 to be in place pending a pilot. It's looking at the moment like the timeline of that pilot, or those pilots, 4 going on in Wales at the moment, will probably prohibit AVR rolling out for the 2026 elections. So there was a First Minister's question the other day where the First Minister, by Adam Price, and the First Minister kind of hinted at this. She said the timing would be difficult. I think it's still possible, but unlikely. And it's a real shame because, this timeline was set by the Welsh Government. Yes, it was an amendment made to the bill, but they accepted that. They could have set this timeline to allow for changes to be made. Their argument is that, the pilot deadline is until the end of September. The Electoral Commission report won't come out until December, January. There's no time with the Gold Convention to actually implement AVR as a result of that. My argument is that they could have planned for this a bit better.
Yes, it sounds suspiciously like politicking for maybe underhand reasons.
I think it's about leadership, and I think if we wanted to make this happen in Wales, we could. It just requires a lot of leadership and really pushing on this matter. And the reality is, it means that 400,000 people, roughly, next election will be locked out of democracy again. And removing that barrier of registration would, I think, really open doors to people. It would change the kind of way the election runs. What we see ahead of an election every single time is a huge amount of effort. Remember to register by this deadline, and then there isn't that effort to kind of get out and turn out the vote. If we remove that registration thing, we can have all of our kind of attention on that turnout question.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me is, there's both the automatic registration, the closed list system that came in instead of the single transferable vote, which I believe the ERS advocates for. And then also, isn't Wales and any parliament that's still working with the idea of people having to put their names forward to assert their right to select their representative and then go out and physically do that in a vote? Is that not just very last century, when there are things such as liquid democracy and digital applications that have been trialled and could be tried more?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different ways of kind of modernising our democracy, and Wales does feel like slightly on the back foot, maybe. I think we're pretty good in comparison to the rest of the UK, but I went to Estonia a few years ago, met with the elections team there. They are much more kind of digital in their approach. They're also kind of, what I think is really good is their kind of combination of both digital and kind of stereo kind of applications of democracy. So, for example, they have loads of information about the elections online. They use automatic voter registration. Every single person gets a letter through their door ahead of the election telling them when the election will take place, where their local polling booth is, or whether other options are available, who their candidates are, and how to actually do the mechanisms of voting. Like, there are really simple things that I think are available that don't kind of require a reinvention of democracy, that Wales could pick up and run with and kind of lead the way.
And has ERS, you said you've done some research trips, but has the ERS got a position on digitalising democracy in any form?
I think we're quite cautious on digitalising democracy, particularly things like online voting. I think there are lots of arguments in theory in favour, but in practice there are lots of security concerns that kind of really need ironing out. But I think there's small steps particularly with regards to kind of the information available online. We know that democracy is in an online space at the moment. There's a lot of chat about politics on social media, for example. So how do we create a space online that is more informative, that is fair, that kind of tackles that dis and misinformation? I think there is a role for it.
Well, it strikes me that the world that has been presented to politicians and political parties through digital platforms and social media is ideal for politics, and yet I feel that many of the parties haven't fully grasped it or understood how to use that to engage people. Is that something that the ERS is looking at or working on, or have you a personal view on that?
I don't think it's necessarily something that ERS is working on, bar it kind of taking place in that conversation around mis and disinformation. I think that's fair to say. But what I would definitely agree with what you said in terms of, I think parties are really trying to grapple with it at the moment, and some are better than others. We've seen Reform do very well on places like TikTok, particularly with younger audiences. And we've seen individual Senedd members do well, and we've seen individual Senedd members not do it very well. So it's a really interesting thing to observe and watch as kind of politicians try and grapple with a completely changing landscape for them.
Yeah, I suppose that the danger is maybe gamifying politics or making politicians into celebrities isn't necessarily a healthy thing for the democratic process or developing meaningful policy. So navigating that is obviously tricky, but there's one of the things with the ERS, as I understand it, and what I've read of its history, is obviously across the UK it's been advocating for proportional system for is it over 100 years now? Yeah,
so we set up in 1884, and I don't look a day over
and it seems, again, looking into history, there was an opportunity for Westminster in 1918 to bring a proportional system, which was narrowly voted down. And then there's been various other attempts, private members' bills and things. But there seems very little impetus from Westminster to change the whole of the United Kingdom. And I wondered whether with Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales sort of almost innovating and moving ahead of Westminster, Westminster isn't actually putting itself into a position where it's undermining its own democratic right to exist.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the first past the post system that Westminster use is increasingly breaking. I think it is probably broken now. What we've seen in the most recent local elections in England under first past the post is a complete fragmentation. So what that means is voters are moving parties more than they ever have before. It also means that people are voting for more different parties than they ever have before. Prior to this year's local elections, the combined two-party vote share, so that's the Conservative and Labour vote share, had only ever once been under 50%. This time around, it was like 32%. Like it is stark, the change in our kind of UK politics and democracy at the moment. And Wales will, I think, have an increased number of parties representing the Senedd next year. There will be that fragmentation, but we have the electoral system that can kind of cope with that. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if this is 2029, whenever the next general election may be, you're heading into a Westminster election with this level of fragmentation and the first past the post system, that is going to lead to wild results that are just completely not representing what people are voting for. So I think there is more of an impetus than ever for parties in Westminster to really grapple with this problem, like grasp the nettle. I don't know if they will. That remains to be seen. But there's a ticking clock here.
And do you think that the main political parties have understood or want to understand that the electoral landscape in Wales is distinctly different from the United Kingdom as a whole? Because we see both the Conservatives and Labour particularly being run from London. I would say the same with Liberal Democrats. The the policies that they put in place that do well with the majority English electorate don't necessarily serve the people of Wales?
Well, I think that is being increasingly demonstrated. I think there are real, I don't know if I'd go as far as saying rifts, but real kind of challenges and conversations within Welsh Labour and UK Labour at the moment that kind of demonstrate how difficult that is to navigate when you have UK parties not really that engaged in Wales and an election like creeping up on us next year. So certainly I think that there is a challenge there. And I don't think typically the UK parties kind of get Wales. I think that is also demonstrated in the media landscape. There was, well, there's been a number of podcasts kind of focusing on Wales in the last couple of weeks from a UK media set. One of them only spoke about reform. I think Plaid Cymru were mentioned in the final kind of minute or so of that podcast. Plaid Cymru are polling in second place, maybe likely to form the government next year. I think there's just that lack of understanding from a Westminster kind of bubble is really becoming an issue.
Well, from my conversation with, and full disclosure, I was once very heavily involved with the Liberal Democrats, but from my conversation with Liberal Democrat MPs, many of them aren't even aware there is a Senedd election next year.
Well, on that note, I read in a newsletter this week, there was a LBC debate last weekend, and the host asked the question of, should Wales get a parliament similar to Scotland? Like, what? It's only 25 years too late.
Yes. And of course, you still have surveys that are brought out which ask the question if the Senedd should be abolished, which you would never get about Westminster or Holyrood.
No, exactly.
So how do we go beyond just reforming structures then to make and reshape the political culture in Wales, to make it a bit more open and ambitious and maybe cooperative amongst political parties, so that people are working for Wales rather than their political party?
Well, that is a big question, I think a difficult one to answer, particularly with the kind of political climate we find ourselves in at the moment. We're increasingly divided. Levels of public trust are at rock bottom. The democratic deficit is still an issue 26 years into devolution. But I think one of the ways we kind of can reset is to address that democratic deficit. So that requires really good democratic education. It requires probably deliberative democracy techniques, really involving people in our political culture. But none of these things are a panacea, and this is all really difficult to do, especially, there's a phrase that my colleague Willie always uses, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And when the political partisan culture is in such a tricky place in Wales at the moment, that almost prevents all of this from happening.
But then, to draw on that idea of culture, Wales has a very distinct culture of its own, separate to the rest of the United Kingdom, separate to England. And you see communities in Wales which generally tend to look after each other. So is there, and going back to the idea of the social media, is there not more scope for people, individuals and communities in Wales to advocate for themselves, to use social media, to get put pressure and gain control of housing policy and energy in their area and so forth?
Yeah, I think there is potential. I think there is an amazing amount of work that takes place across Wales, particularly in local communities that have demonstrated community activism, empowerment, really good examples of deliberative democracy. I don't think our kind of political structures are in place to kind of allow that to kind of infiltrate decision making at the moment. So we need to look at things like improving like our institutions' ability to do deliberative democracy better. A really good example I always find is, so I do a load of work around open government in Wales. So the Open Government Partnership was set up by Barack Obama and David Cameron in like 2011. Nearly about 100 countries across the world take part in the Open Government Partnership. 3 of the countries in the UK are involved in the Open Government Partnership. Do you want to guess which one isn't? It's us. So, and this is an idea that, Wales could be on a global stage, publishing commitments around accountability, transparency, participation. And at the moment, we're really not engaging in that kind of conversation at the moment. So that is one example of how our institutions are just not built to kind of develop transparency or accountability.
Is that down to an institutional structural aspect, a lack of political will, awareness? Why is Wales not engaged in that?
I think it's probably leadership. Like, Wales has kind of voluntarily published some plans around it. It looks likely they won't be continuing to do that at the moment. And every time I've mentioned to Welsh government or written to the First Minister about, Wales should join Scotland and Northern Ireland on this stage, it's been, we're kind of already doing stuff.
This is interesting because, as I mentioned to you and people that have listened to this podcast before, know that I've been talking with a lot of business leaders from the Welsh diaspora and people that have interest in the Welsh migrant history and things from the 18th, 19th century. And something that's come out of that is very much what you've just brought up there about the lack of leadership in Wales at the moment. And again, you draw Scotland, there's also the Republic of Ireland. They're both nations that seem to know what they are, what they want to be to the world. Their global image has been decided, and they're out there promoting it. And they're very good at, particularly the Irish, are very good at engaging with their diaspora, and very good at getting their diaspora to engage with the political structures back in Ireland. And yet the Wales seems to have not worked out what it is or what it wants to be. And that comes across with a lot of the conversations I have with the diaspora. They get very frustrated that a representative from the Welsh government will turn up in Dubai, say, and they seem to be more on a jolly rather than actually trying to promote Wales or make business connections. Yeah. So is that something that is down to a lack of confidence in itself as a nation, or is it because of the fact that we've got 3 million diaspora, so maybe the talents left Wales? Why do you think that Wales is failing to build that?
Well, I hope we've still got some talent in Wales. I know loads. Yes. No, I think there is a thing about Wales on the global stage, 100%, and you'll know better than me about how the diaspora is engaged with. But I think we don't have we've had really great examples of Wales on the global stage. I could, look at Wrexham Football Club at the moment. That's a really great example. But that needed
an individual from outside of Wales to have put their own money into something and have developed that passion. That's sort of a project, a fun project for that wealthy individual. And Wales can't build itself or a global image on the hope that individuals like that turn up.
No.
There are many diaspora out there that maybe have some similar amounts of disposable cash, but there doesn't seem to be a policy in place to engage with them and get them to invest in sport or culture, or indeed building more business in Wales.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think there are a number of reasons for this, and partly I think there is lack of leadership, especially on a global stage. But there's also, I think, historic reasons. Scotland having that kind of distinct identity prior to devolution. We have had that in Wales, but it's our political identity hasn't been that different. So we're kind of developing this, I would say, at a slower rate, I think it's fair to say. You've also kind of not got that kind of inward investment kind of platform that other nations have. And I think it's a real challenge for the Welsh government. There are some examples, like the Welsh government would always advocate for their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and the fact that that's kind of put Wales on the global stage. I would say that has, to an extent. I think there's more that can be done. And I think integrating things like that into the Open Government Partnership that I just mentioned, for example, I go to their conferences every 2 years across the world. There's ministers from nearly 100 different countries. I'm normally the only person there from Wales. We should be shouting in Wales about how much we've done even on our democratic issues, we have votes to 16. I've sat in a number of panels all across the world where people go, oh, has anyone thought about votes to 16? And I'm like, we've been doing this for years. Like there are really good examples. It's just pushing Wales onto that global stage to be able to shout about what we are and what we're doing.
Well, I think that's where I was going, and I go to a lot of international conferences for my own interest, but also as a mining engineer, and talk about Wales. And obviously, people know Wales in the mining world from its history, but it does seem to have faded in its identity, and the identity does seem to be very muddled with the rest of the United Kingdom. So, as you say, unless we get the leaders to have that clear vision and engage with it, and again, as someone that lives in Quebec has a very distinct identity and it has its missions around the world, which I know Wales has as well to a limited extent. And I just wonder whether Wales could be doing more there, whether it's curtailed by the politics. I was also interested in your thoughts on the language side of things, thinking again with Quebec. Obviously, Quebec's very, I guess I would use the word militant in its defence of the French language and its Quebecois. Yet the Welsh society seems a little bit divided on the Welsh language. I, again, drawing on my conversations in this podcast, there are individuals from the southeast of Wales who don't know any Welsh or very little Welsh and don't really have an interest in learning any of it. And they seem to have sectioned themselves out from the Welsh-speaking part of Welsh society. So I wonder if there's more that could be done on bringing the communities together, or whether there really is that divide there.
I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think the Welsh language is something that Wales should be massively proud of. It really just, it's something distinct, and it's something that is embedded in our history and has a really, I think, complicated history. Through kind of the last few centuries. So it's something that we really should be proud about and shouting on the world stage. I'm always struck when I go to Northern Ireland. I work quite a lot in Northern Ireland, and I always have a chat with taxi drivers, and they're always moaning about Gaelic, and the idea of the potential of having bilingual road signs really seems to scare them. And I'm like, this is something that we have in Wales that people maybe aren't that aware of. We have it embedded in our kind of political culture and our history, and it's something to really be proud of, I think.
Well, I'd agree, and again, it tends to be more of a norm across a lot of the world, where most people speak a couple of languages. So, and I guess it also is something that I guess what I'm trying to draw out of you or discuss is the upside of having more than one language, especially in your younger generation, in a globalizing economy. And Wales obviously needs to be focused on its globalized economy. So clearly having a second language other than English helps. I know Welsh itself isn't spoken broadly, but it helps develop the brain in order to be able to pick up the other languages. But that conversation doesn't seem to be in the politics of Wales. Learning the Welsh language for its historical and cultural context seems to be there, but not how it will improve Wales economically.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting observation. Yeah, we know typically that learning a second language, especially as a young person, really can improve your kind of outcomes educationally. It's a really good thing to have. So yeah, I think it's right that is a conversation that should be taking place, for sure.
So going forward then, what's the ERS's hope for where Wales goes with its electoral reform? Is there a time scale? Do depending on who forms the next government, does the ERS see the electoral system for the Senedd changing once again after these elections in 2026?
Well, that's the hope. I mean, we're in a really difficult short-term position in Wales at the moment. So we're going into the next election with closed list PR system we already talked about, but that was, I think, very much seen as a compromise system. So as the bill that changed the electoral system was progressing, numerous MSs talked about this as a kind of temporary electoral system, with this idea that they would inbuild a review mechanism in the legislation that could be set up after the next election. So the hope has always been, from my understanding within the political parties currently in the Senedd, that they could just review the electoral system after the next election if they don't like it, and potentially then move to the single transferable vote, which is something that we'd advocated for and all of the parties in the Senedd in some way kind of advocated for, but yet it didn't weirdly happen. I'm just going to leave that one there. But I think the climate that we find ourselves in, where it looks like there is a huge amount of fragmentation in the polls at the moment, Reform, who are a big unknown in terms of the Senedd, may have a sizable presence. We don't, I think, find ourselves in the position that many thought they would be at, where we could just go into the next Senedd election, have a closed list election, and then change the electoral system easily after the next election. There are so many unknowns in that, and I think it really is a missed opportunity. My hope is that the electoral system does get reviewed post May 2026, but I'm a little bit of a realist here, and I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to do that.
And that's just down to the political will or the likely makeup of the next Senedd.
I think it's down to the numbers, right? So to change the electoral system, a 2/3 majority is required. At the moment, it looks really unclear as to whether that 2/3 majority is at all reachable. We don't know. You know, the Reform Party have spoken about in favour of PR in the past. Most recently, they've been seeming to shy away from that, as they've done well under first past the post elections in England. So it's a complete unknown. We don't know where the party is going to stand on this post election, and I think that might make things really complicated.
Well, I was going to mention, I mean, in the manifesto, Reform has single transferable vote as a desire for Westminster and all elections. So, interesting. So I guess what gives you hope then for the years ahead for Wales, and where do you see Wales in the next 15, 20 years from now?
Well, I think for all of the kind of criticisms are probably levelled about what happens, Wales is really ahead, I think, of the rest of the UK when it comes to kind of democratic innovation. We are trialling automatic voter registration. That is the first place in the UK that is taking place. We have extended the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds on all foreign nationals. Yes, we followed Scotland in extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, but we were the first to do all foreign nationals. So anyone resident in Wales over the age of 16 has the right to vote in our devolved elections. That is a really good story to tell, I think, on both a UK stage and a global stage. We always seem to criticise ourselves, but actually, quietly, we've been chipping away, removing barriers to democracy. And I really hope that continues. You know, if we're talking about the next 20 years, I would hope we have a democratic system that really works, and it works for everyone in Wales, that has a huge amount of investment in democratic education, both within schools and on a lifelong learning basis. And we have our institutions that are fully set up to engage people properly through deliberative democracy, you know, really involving people in decision making. And I think that all in turn will address the massive levels we see in terms of distrust at the moment and the democratic deficit that we're facing.
Jess Blair, diolch yn fawr. Thank you for being today's guest.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this conversation, have comments or to add, or would like to participate in an episode of Blueprint Cymru, head over to the New Wales website, which is new.wales.